Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to HRPO Grand Rounds. I am Jim Campbell, and I am in the Department of Pediatrics in the Infectious Disease Division. I work at the Center for Vaccine Development, but I'm also one of the vice chairs on the Institutional Review Board. And so I'm sure some of you I know are investigators, coordinators, some work at HRPO, but for those of you who don't know in terms of what that means to be vice chair, so our IRB has one single chairman of the IRB and then has multiple people who are called vice chairs. And essentially the vice chairs are the people, the chair and the vice chairs are those who run meetings, who chair IRB meetings. And we also do reviews, both the full reviews that go to the full board and expedited or designated reviewer reviews where they don't go to the full board but just to a single board member. So today we're going to talk about pediatric research and the ethical and regulatory considerations. This does not need to be very formal, so at any point you can ask me questions. You don't have to wait until the end. A couple of times I'm going to try to ask you to give me examples. So like when we talk about minimal risk or greater than minimal risk, try to think of things either if you've worked at HRPO or if you're an investigator or a coordinator, things that you think might fit into those categories, and we'll go through some of the examples. All right, so let's start with this. If you take Route 1 south, drive about 8 miles, 10 miles until you get to Montgomery Road, make a right and go west, go about a half mile, go over 95, make your first right, you'll come on this. This is the Belmont Mansion. This is where in 1979 the National Commission on the Protection of Human Subjects took place. Now if you go out the back door of the Belmont Mansion through those woods and keep going and then go over a river, the Patapsco River, about a quarter of a mile or so and across one street, you'll be at my house. So I live in the same town where the Belmont Commission. I didn't know that until after I started on the IRB. We all hear about the Belmont Report, but now I know it's right in my town. So there were 3 principles that came out of the Belmont Report that we use in all of research ethics now. So the principle of respect for persons or autonomy, which mainly has to do with the consenting process, that we respect people and that they can make their own decisions about whether or not they want to be in research. Now for children, that becomes a very special thing because how do children who most people would think don't have the capacity to consent, how do we respect their autonomy and continue to do things ethically for them? So that's something that you need to think about. As we go through this talk, I always like for people to think we often get hung up on the nitty-gritty little regulations, but they're there really to try to make sure that we comply with the bigger picture, with the actual ethics. So I want you to be thinking about these principles, but realizing also what we do at HRPO and the IRB is to try to apply specific regulations that help us to conform to the principles. So you have autonomy, respect for persons. Then you have beneficence, right, doing good, or the flip side of do no harm, non-maleficence. So a lot of what we talk about in all of research ethics, but also specifically in the pediatric regulations is there the prospect of direct benefit for the individual children? And you'll see that's a lot of what the IRB will focus on when you submit protocols to them. And then the third principle in the Belmont Report is that of justice. So there's lots of definitions of justice, but what they were talking about mainly in Belmont had to do with what we call distributive justice, which means that persons who take on the burden of research or communities or groups of people, but also individual persons who take on those burdens should be afforded the benefits. So we don't want to do testing of whatever it is your research that you're doing on groups that could never, or persons that could never or will never receive the possible benefits. So that's why we shouldn't use children to try to get an answer for something that children might not benefit. So keep those principles in mind, and we're going to go through some historical examples now of pediatric research and see what you think about whether or not they were followed. So let's start with this guy. So this gentleman in the upper left, some of you may recognize him. His name is Edward Jenner. He was a British physician in the 18th century. And he noticed, and others had noticed, that milkmaids, people who on his farm who milked cows, if they got infected by a disease called cowpox that infected the udders of the cows, if they got that on their hands, they seemed not to get smallpox. And at this point, smallpox, the human disease, was one of the worst diseases that was afflicting people. So he thought, well, if the milkmaids who get cowpox are protected from smallpox, maybe I can purposefully infect other people with cowpox and protect them from smallpox. So in 1796, on May 14th, in the lower left, you see Edward Jenner there. He takes his scalpel, makes two little incisions on James Phipps's arm. James Phipps is an 8-year-old who is the son of Edward Jenner's gardener. And he asked his gardener whether or not he could purposefully infect his son with cowpox. So I know you're thinking now about autonomy, beneficence, protection of people's rights to choose for themselves, about vulnerable populations, about all of that, right? So as we go through these, remember to think about these principles. Okay, so Jenner takes cowpox from a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms, who happened to be milking that cow in the upper right. Her name is Blossom. Unfortunately, right below that nice painting of Blossom is at the Jenner Museum is Blossom's hide, which still exists. Blossom doesn't, but her hide does. Okay, so he infects little Jimmy Phipps with cowpox, and Jimmy gets a little sick a week later. He's got fever, and he has a rash on his, a lesion on his arm, doesn't feel very well, but gets over that. And then 6 weeks later, he tries to infect him with smallpox, and he doesn't get infected. So he challenges him with the natural virus. And Jimmy, like other kids at that time, they sleep with lots of little kids, all the gardeners' kids and all the people that work on Jenner's homestead. And even though he tried to challenge him with smallpox and he didn't get infected, neither did any of the contacts of James Phipps, so the people that were sleeping in the same bed with him and the kids that he played with. So over the next weeks and years, Jenner tries 20 times to infect him with smallpox and is never successful. So he says, it works, cowpox works to protect people. So then what he does is infects people with cowpox and then takes the pus that's draining from the cowpox, collects it, and then infects another person, and then takes the pus from them. It takes about a week to develop those pustules, the pus from them, and infects another person, and keeps doing that down the line. And many of those people work for him. They're laborers on his farm. Some of them are inmates in the local jail, and they don't get infected either with smallpox. So he takes all that information, he writes it up, he presents it to the Royal College of Physicians in Great Britain, and eventually that becomes our first real vaccination. Vaccine, vaccination, vaccin, if you speak French, means cow. Vaca in Latin means cow. So we call it vaccination because Edward Jenner took cowpox and gave it to prevent smallpox. But he used a child. He was a vulnerable subject. He essentially, it would be very difficult for his gardener to say no, right? And you can see in the lower right-hand corner, this cottage was left to James Phipps by Dr. Edward Jenner in recognition of his having been the first person that Dr. Jenner vaccinated against smallpox. So, compensation. Is it undue influence to give this gardener's son a house? He grew up, James Phipps grew up very healthy, had 2 kids, lived in that house. So anyway, so that's the first example for you. It was the first time that vaccination occurred, or modern vaccination occurred, and we may have, if this came before the IRB at this point, we may have some troubles with it. Okay, now fast forward almost 100 years to Paris, and this gentleman in the lower left is Louis Pasteur. So you know about pasteurization, he's a microbiologist who figured out a lot of things about a lot of microorganisms in the late 19th century. So one of the things he was working on was rabies. And he figured out, the picture on the right is Louis Pasteur holding two bunnies. And he figured out that if he took secretions, virus, rabies from dogs, and that's the main animal that had rabies, and injected rabbits, he could infect them and get lots of rabies virus into their spinal cords. And then they would die, and he would take the spinal cords and hold them out and dry them for a long period until they became completely desiccated, like a powder. And then he turned that powder into a liquid injectable form and started seeing, his question was, I wonder whether if you take this powdered spinal cord from rabbits and inject it into dogs that have rabies, would it cure it? Nothing could cure rabies. Before that, once you had a rabid animal or a rabid person, they all died. So he did that with 50 dogs, and they survived. He was able to, if you gave the rabies vaccine early enough, the dogs would survive. So in 1885, July 4th, 1885, the young boy on the upper right, Joseph Meister, he didn't live in Paris. He lived in Alsace in the north of France. And he was bitten by his neighbor's dog 14 times, pretty beat up. The dog was rabid, and they thought for sure he'd die. But the neighbor and his parents knew about, I don't know how, but they knew about what Louis Pasteur was doing in Paris. And so they came down from Alsace to Paris and asked him, and that's what this photograph is in the upper left, you've never given this to people before, but our son's going to die. Are you willing to give that dog rabies shot to our son? And Louis Pasteur originally said no. Eventually he went to some other, quote, experts, if you will, an IRB, two people, and asked them, what do you think? And they said, the boy's going to die. And if you don't inject him, and we don't know what the safety is in humans, but we think it's okay. So he decided to give the vaccine to the boy, 13 shots over 10 days, and he survived. Did not die of rabies. As a matter of fact, became the caretaker, one of the guards at the Institut Pasteur, and lived there, worked there until 1940, when, unfortunately, when the Nazis took Paris, he killed himself. But again, think about whether or not we would allow first in human to go for a vaccine or a drug to go to a child. And Louis Pasteur actually was not a physician, so he was essentially untrained. We would not allow someone who hadn't gotten a medical degree or another form of training to be able to inject people, and probably hadn't done his city training prior to injecting him. Okay, so we have two examples early on of vaccinating young children. Then move forward even a little bit more now to the United States, and you're a parent of a child who has what we would now call intellectual disabilities or intellectual challenges, then called mental retardation. You live in Waltham, Massachusetts, so you put your child into a residential institution called the Fernand School. And among all the kids with mental retardation there, your child is one of the brighter kids, so they ask him if he wants to be in the science club. And being in the science club means you get to meet the investigators from MIT in Boston. And the people in MIT are working on a project that has to do with radioactive calcium and iron, and they're not sure what the effects are on people. So they tell the parents that the children, the brighter kids in the class, are going to receive a special diet, and the special diet is cereal that has radioactive calcium and iron in it to see what the effects might be on those children. Willowbrook, you may have heard of this one before, Willowbrook State School Studies from the 1950s to the 1960s. Willowbrook is a similar institution on Staten Island in New York. And most of the children there, over the course of living there, would get hepatitis A because of hygienic issues. It's transferred in the stool, and because of difficulty keeping the children with good hygiene, there would be a lot of hepatitis A there. So one of the researchers there was trying to look at what the natural history of hepatitis A was among children. And so he offered sort of like a special offer for parents who wanted to get their kids into the school, which was not easy to get in. It was like a waiting list. But if you were willing to come off the waiting list in order to be put into the special unit, that special unit was for research. And the research was, we would purposefully infect you with hepatitis A to see what the natural history is. And in that unit, you would get some special things like more hygiene, better nutrition, and as it says there, expedited entry. Okay, so hopefully these are not the types of studies that are coming before the IRB now, but a lot of science came from, at least from those early ones. So let's talk about some of the codes that, that have been put forward after other atrocities or other problems occurred. So one, the Nuremberg Code. As you know, after World War II, this was really the first time that a code was put forward to say that persons had to consent to be in research. And it had, that Nuremberg Code has most of its emphasis on that issue of autonomy. Didn't really address the issue of children. And if you focus on saying, well, only those who can consent for themselves can be in research, it would preclude doing pediatric research at all. But over time, people started looking, thinking, well, how can we make it so that children could be involved in research? And in the Declaration of Helsinki, which started in 1964, but there have been many revisions since then, started to talk about allowing research with children if permission from a responsible relative was given. That Belmont report, we talked about autonomy, beneficence, and justice, and some of the implications for the children. And, the way I look at it, and you're going to see this throughout the talk, that there's this sort of tension. A lot of times in ethics, we talk about these tensions between competing interests. But the tension between unfairly excluding children and when including children, making sure that you protect them from the risks. Because you could say, well, the easiest way to protect them from the risks is never include them. But never including them is not the right thing either, because not knowing what the right drug dose is for a child, not knowing what the best way to give a vaccine to a child, not knowing the effects of various diseases on children, that's not the right answer either. So we have this tension of wanting to include children, but at the same time, giving extra protection from the risks that they may encounter. And the National Commission, that Belmont report, is more kind of global and sweeping in its sort of ethical principles, but it was those principles and those issues that were then turned into specific federal regulations that we now comply with when not just for pediatric research, but for all research. So the Code of Federal Regulations, which I know all of you have just been waiting for me to get to the Code of Federal Regulations, and it's coming soon, so, don't hold your breath, but here it comes. It's those regulations that we now try to follow are based on the National Commission, the Belmont Report. Okay, and then sort of the last historical thing, but an important thing in the state of Maryland, is this court case that occurred in the early 2000s. So it's known as Grimes versus Kennedy Krieger Institute. There were actually two plaintiffs, Grimes and Higgins. And the story was that the EPA and others sponsored Hopkins, the Kennedy Krieger Institute at Hopkins, to do a study looking at lead paint abatement. So children who are exposed to lead, it's mainly through lead paint and then chipping and dust that occurs in houses that are painted with lead paint, meaning older houses. You can also get it from other sources, but primarily through lead paint. Children who are exposed to that can get high lead levels and then have various medical problems, from pretty minor to very major, even to dying with very high levels of, if you have very high levels of lead. But in order to, quote, abate lead from houses, what's called full abatement, it's huge cost. To say we're going to take all the paint off of the house, remove all of the windows, clean everything up, and then replace it all, very costly. And in many instances in Baltimore and elsewhere, when groups when the government said to landlords that they needed to fully abate their home, the places they were renting, they would abandon them because the cost of a full abatement was multiples more than the worth of the home. So if people had to continue doing that, low cost housing would kind of go away. But there was debate as to what appropriate abatement might be, if there were other forms of abatement besides, quote, full abatement that would still lower the risk for the children getting exposed to lead. So Hopkins did this study. There were 5 groups. One of them was a control group of houses that were built after 1980, so there was no lead in them. Another one was another type of control group where there was already, quote, full abatement of the house. And then 3 of them were experimental groups, and that was to look at 3 different levels of abatement, of lead abatement. And families were in those homes, and then they tested both the environment, soil, paint chips, dust, and the children's blood over 2 years, at intervals over 2 years. And so the study started in 1993, and then in 2000, a suit was brought against Kennedy Krieger by 2 people, the Grimes and the Higgins, saying that Krieger was negligent. Now, in the law, in order to prove negligence, you need 3 things. You have to prove that the person or the group that was negligent had a duty to the plaintiff. You have to also prove that they breached that duty. And then you have to prove that the breach led to harm. And if you can prove those 3 things, then you prove negligence. Well, Hopkins' lawyers said, well, it's all very nice what the plaintiffs have said, but we think you should have a summary judgment, meaning the judge should just dismiss the whole thing because we have no duty, as defined by the law, to the plaintiffs. And the judge in 2000, as you can see there, summary judgment 2000, they agreed. The judge said, you have no duty, it doesn't matter what the actual details of the case are, because there was no duty between the researchers and the plaintiffs. They went to appeals, and in the Court of Appeals, they reversed that summary judgment. And not only did they say that they had a duty, but they went way beyond that and said things like this was not in the best interest of the children, that actually the parents have no authority to consent, even if the consent form was written well, that the parents cannot consent to this type of research because it's not in the best interest of the child. And they even went on to say things like the researchers and the IRB were completely unethical, didn't follow the rules. It's a pretty scathing report. What does it mean for us? Well, first of all, could this have been avoided? I mean, it's easy 20/20 hindsight now, but maybe not easy, but you can think of ways that this could have been avoided. One, looking at the way that the people were consented, there were things that were not completely fully explained. And they're there, but they're not completely fully explained. How could you make sure that parents understood exactly what's in the consent? Well, one way sometimes we do is by having a quiz, a comprehension quiz. If in that quiz it said, you understand that your child is going to be living in a house that has lead and we're trying to abate it, and it's possible that your child will have elevated lead levels. But that wasn't done. There was no comprehension quiz. There was no witness. There wasn't somebody else who watched the consent occurring to say, yeah, all the questions were answered, they completely understood. There were also, at least my reading of it is, there wasn't really aggressive contacting of the parents and the providers. And I think that's something we would look for in the IRB is if you're going to have children in houses that maybe have high lead, then how are you going to make sure that as soon as you know that there's lead in the house, that the parents know, that their providers know? What are your ways of contacting them? How quickly do you need to contact them? That sort of thing. And then another benefit that could have been provided would be saying that if there's ever elevated blood level, EBL, that you would make sure as a researcher that they would have care, that you follow up on what that care was. There's various things that you could put in there as a potential benefit for them. You could also have a data safety monitoring board that says every X amount of time some independent group is going to look to see, have you followed up for all the kids? You know, have you found enough evidence that, let's say, minimal abatement is bad for people and the lead levels are high? Or you say if a child's lead level gets above X, they can't live in that house anymore until full abatement is done, or something else. Those pieces were not in the trial. This court case does not lead to specific new restrictions in Maryland. There's no new laws in Maryland that change because of Grimes, but it does make us more worried, if you will, about making sure that we're really careful, especially when we have research that's what in HRPO speak is GTMR, greater than minimal risk. So whenever I'm asked within pediatrics or IRB or HRPO or through our mentoring program, well, what are some ways that we can avoid these problems? One of the main things that makes it much easier for everyone, including the children, is that you try to do your best to come up with ways that you can always have the prospect of direct benefit for the child. Now, it's not always possible, but it's almost always possible. There are a few exceptions, but if people think through how to design their studies or what other pieces to put into their study to try to provide individual benefit to the children, then it makes us the worry about compliance, if you will, with the Grimes issue just not as important, not as, you know, we don't have to think about it as much if there's a prospect of direct benefit. So can anybody think of a way that you can add in the prospect of direct benefit to a study that includes children? An example either in the design, yeah.
One way is the fact that they have more follow-up which potentially would catch complications sooner.
Yeah, so that's a potential way that you could have the prospect of direct benefit, being that, let's say, in this instance, they were doing blood lead levels, I think it was like 8 times over a 2-year period. Most children would only have their blood lead checked maybe once a year, unless it was abnormal, and 95% of the houses in the area where this study was being done had high lead levels. Lots of kids were, you know, being intoxicated, if you will, with lead and not getting appropriate follow-up. So giving better follow-up than what you would normally get could potentially be considered prospect of direct benefit. What else? Can anybody think of anything else? Things like, instead of giving a placebo in certain studies, you could give an active arm. So like in vaccines, we could give bird flu vaccine versus placebo for kids, or we could say bird flu vaccine versus this other vaccine that normally you don't get, but you'll get a benefit by getting the vaccine. So everyone could potentially get a benefit by being in the study. Things like crossover designs sometimes will give you the prospect of direct benefit for placebo-controlled trials. So you may say, well, yeah, while you're on the placebo arm, you're not getting direct benefit. But in the course of the trial, you are, because half of the trial you're getting the drug and half you're getting placebo, and then in the middle we switch. And so everybody at some point in the trial has some prospect of direct benefit. So those are some examples, but there are many others. If you're designing or submitting to the IRB things that are greater than minimal risk, you need to be thinking about what could be the prospect of direct benefit for any child in the study. I told you get it. Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR. So all of the little picayune things that you get back from us at the IRB that have to do with pediatrics, and probably just about everything else, is not because we made up any of those rules at HRPO. All of our checklists, all of the things that we go through have to do with making sure we're in compliance with the Code of Federal Regulations. These are the law. These are the federal laws that tell us how we need to do our business as an IRB and as a research community. And so the CFR has 50 titles. The 45th title, 45 CFR and the Part 46 has to do with public welfare in the United States. Well, all of 45, the Title 45 is public welfare. The 46th part is human research. Don't confuse that with 46 CFR 45. Does anybody know what that is? So if you have, like, it's easy to switch those around, right? So if you go to 46 CFR 45, that has to do with load lines on ships in the Great Lakes. So it has absolutely nothing to do with human research. Okay, so within 45 CFR 46, there's a special section that has to do with vulnerable populations. There are 3 sections, B, C, and D. What we call Part D has to do with kids, the pediatric regulations. It was added in 1983, and it adds additional protections. Now, go to Webster's or go to the Maryland law and look up child, and you won't find this definition. But if you go to the Code of Federal Regulations, you will find this definition, and this is what has to be used. We call children, these people, persons who have not attained the legal age for consent to treatments or procedures involved in the research under the applicable law of the jurisdiction in which the research will be conducted. Most of the time, that just means under 18, you do not have not reached the legal age to consent for those treatments. But there are certain things in Maryland, and they're different in other states, where what normally you call children, but we should probably just call minors, people under 18, have reached the legal age for consent to those treatments. And if they have, Part D doesn't affect them. They are not children by the federal law, by this federal law. Okay, so you'll see why that's important when we talk about mature minors. So before we look at Part D, the first thing that happens when you submit to the IRB is first we want to make sure, is it human subject research? And again, you have to go to the definitions to figure that out. So if it's practice or if it's off-label practice, those things are not research. If it's quality improvement, performance improvement, those things are not research. To be research, it has to be a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute generalizable knowledge. So we look at those things. Is it systematic? Is it an investigation? And do you expect to be generalizable? And if it meets those, we say, yes, it's research. And we say, are there humans involved? To be humans, they have to be living, so we don't count dead people. Individuals about whom an investigator conducting research obtains one, data through, so it has to be data, and you either have to intervene or interact with the individual, or using identifiable and private information. And if you meet those, then it's human subject research. If you don't, then we send you something back that says, this might still be research, or this might still be humans, but it's not human subject research. Why do we have the IRB review? Which hopefully it's to help the investigators to minimize the risks, to optimize the benefit to risk ratio, to assure that there's a valid informed consent, both the form and the process, to assure or improve the respectful ethical treatment of children and adults. And all of those are the sort of the ethical issues. And then the last one, regulatory requirements are met. And as I said, we use checklists to make sure that each of those things that are in the Code of Federal Regulations are complied with. Most people think of risks as side effects. So you give a drug and what are the side effects? And those are the physical risks. But there are a lot of other risks that we look at and you should be thinking about. So the risks of pain or discomfort, mainly due to procedures. And we're looking all the time, we're not looking at no risk because there is no research with no risk. We're looking at minimizing risk. Is there any way that you could do the research, still get your answers, but have less risk? That's the important thing the investigators, the sponsors should be looking at. It's what the IRB reviewers should be looking at. Minimizing risk, minimizing pain and discomfort, other forms of distress, psychological problems like anxiety, guilt, and sadness, social, economic, and legal issues. Sometimes we ask questions about illegal activity. So if that were to be divulged, that's a risk. There are stigma risks. Just by engaging in, if you are a gay man in Uganda and you go into a gay man MSM type study, you're potentially putting yourself at lots of risk. Stigma, physical risk, people have been killed. Okay, so what are the categories? This is the crux of what we do in terms of looking at risk in children. The numbers don't really matter, but that is what's in the CFR. So when we say 45, CFR 46, then it's got point numbers. So 0.404, 0.405, 0.406, and 0.407 are the four categories that pediatric research can be put into. So 404s are minimal risk. Prospect of direct benefit, we don't care. They could, they may not. It doesn't really matter in terms of categorizing, because if you're minimal risk, you could or you couldn't. It doesn't matter if you have prospect of direct benefit. Only one parent has to give permission, and as you'll see, all of these require assent from the children. 405, the next category up, is where it's greater than minimal risk, but with the prospect of direct benefit. And I'm going to go through each of these in a little more detail. It has to be justified, the risk has to be justified by the anticipated benefit, and it has to be at least as favorable as alternatives, meaning like standard of care. The prospect of direct benefit must justify the risks. In other words, we're looking for more benefit and less risks. And it can be as few as one parent who gives permission, and again, assent from the children. The highest level that our IRB or any IRB in the United States can approve as an IRB is the 406 level. And that is it's greater than minimal risk, but only a minor increase over minimal risk. And there's no prospect of direct benefit. So you're allowed to have no prospect of direct benefit as long as the level of risk is only a minor increase over minimal. Two parents need to give permission, and again, assent from the children. 407 is where it's a greater than minor increase over minimal risk, and there's no prospect of direct benefit. IRBs cannot approve this. IRBs go through some information, which I'll give you in a minute. Who approves this? The Cabinet, the Secretary of Health and Human Services through OHRP. So it's only the Secretary of HHS that can approve 407s, as we call 407s. You don't have to call them by those numbers, but this is what all the pediatric reviewers will be using if you send a protocol to the IRB to give you a risk category. The regulations dictate what we have to look at. We have to look at the risk, and that's either minimal, greater than minimal with a minor increase. Is there a prospect of direct benefit? How many parents need to give permission? And do the children need to give assent based on their age and maturity? So, as I say here, it's all about the definitions. It's important, if you're going to be submitting things or reviewing them, that you know what those definitions are, because otherwise we can't really make the determinations. So if you look, again, minimal risk, that doesn't mean low risk. I'm going to give you the definition of minimal risk, but it does not mean low risk. You'll see what the definition is in a second. So as I say at the bottom here, state your case to the IRB. An educated consumer is our best customer. That was an old saying by someone on Long Island, a guy who sold things on Long Island when I was growing up. And it's true, if you know what we're going to be reviewing, it definitely helps you to say specifically why you think this is minor increase over minimal risk, or why you think there's a prospect of direct benefit, because that's what we're looking at. Children are vulnerable because they don't have full autonomy, and because of that, we place a higher burden of protection on the investigator and on the regulators, meaning like the IRB and the FDA and the HHS. Those three groups of defined federal vulnerable populations, Part B in the CFR is pregnant women, fetus, and newborns, Part C is prisoners, and Part D is kids. But we all know there are plenty of other people who are vulnerable. We're all vulnerable. But at some level, we say you're more vulnerable, and more vulnerable enough that we want added protections for you. So people like homeless, the very poor, illiterate, students, employees, stigmatized people, those with mental illness. And anybody that you're enrolling in your study that you think is vulnerable, then you should think, how am I going to put in any added protections for them? If they, for whatever the reason is that they're vulnerable, you may have your own ideas about how to give them added protections. So first, the minimal risk group. This is the 404. And you'll see next to each of these, the other Code of Federal Regulations title. Title 21 is where it describes the Food and Drug Administration. So anything that's FDA related has like its mirror image of the HHS regulations. And in FDA speak, this is a 51. So 404's minimal risk. In FDA is 21 CFR 50.51. Same thing. They have the same wording. There's only one or two minor differences between what the FDA and the HHS have to say. Okay, so they don't call it minimal risk. They, of course, want to use a double negative, so they call it not greater than minimal risk. What is minimal risk? Where the probability and magnitude, those are both important, probability and magnitude, of harm or discomfort, so think of both of those things, that are anticipated in the proposed research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical and psychological examinations or tests. If you have a pediatric protocol and you're hoping that it's going to be minimal risk, you shouldn't come to the IRB and say, but this is just not that high. This isn't a high risk thing. This is pretty low risk. Tell us that what you're proposing is no different than what's ordinarily encountered in the daily lives of children or in their routine examinations or psychological tests. That's what we're looking at. So they ask us as the pediatric representative, is this similar to like what a kid would get if they were to come to their routine anticipatory guidance like 1 year visit, or is this more? Is this about how much blood they get drawn? Do lots of kids get PPDs done? Are those like normal things that happen to kids or no? Could we expect a child to get an X-ray? Yes. Could we expect a child to get sedated and an MRI and a lumbar puncture? Probably not. So think about that. That's what is minimal risk. Now, is that specifically defined? Like, is there a list of what's minimal risk? Nope. It's a negotiation between the investigator and the IRB, and we have to decide kind of together, is this minimal risk or not? There's not a list. We can't just check a box for these things. People have asked, is this absolute or relative? So is it the risk of a healthy child living in a relatively safe environment, or is it the risk of these children who are in this particular study? Like if this is a child who has a severe chronic disease, they go through a lot. Does that mean, is it what they normally have in terms of harm and discomfort? No. Most people have said this means a healthy, normal child. All right, I'm not going to go through examples. You can probably think of examples of things that are minimal risk. People would love to have a list. There isn't an approved list, but there are lists out there, and some IRBs give examples of what the minimal risk is. The Institute of Medicine had a big symposium about a decade ago on pediatric research, and they do have a list in there. It's debatable whether or not all the things on the list are appropriately categorized or that we would necessarily come to the same conclusion, but there are lists out there. This is difficult to read because I just PDF copied it from the IOM, but you can see things like history taking, venipuncture, urine collection by a bag is minimal, urine collection by catheter is considered a minor increase over minimal, and urine collection by a suprapubic tap greater than a minor increase over minimal. Chest x-ray minimal, bone density test minimal, and you can look at the other ones. One that I think could potentially be quite debated is near the bottom there. It says bone marrow aspirate with topical pain reduction, pain control. What does it say? Pain relief. They call that a minor increase over minimal. You could make the argument that it's a minor increase. You could also make the argument that it's more than a minor increase. But anyway, those are the sorts of things that we're looking at, is where do you fall in that range. Each IRB decides on a case-by-case basis. And as I said, make your argument. Okay, greater than minimal risk, but with the prospect of direct benefit to the individual child. Prospect means prospect. So some people have said, well, we can't be sure that those kids are going to have a benefit. Well, if you're sure they're going to get a benefit, this isn't research anymore. We do research because we're not sure whether or not this thing is beneficial, and we're trying to figure that out. So they have to have the prospect, and you have to have a pretty good prospect, like you tested this drugs in animals and adults, you've done it in healthy kids, and now you're going to sick kids, whatever it is, that they have a pretty good chance, some chance of benefit. But the level, the bar is at prospect, not definite. Direct benefit means that it's due to the intervention or participation. The FDA does not favor, they've written this, although some people make their determinations on this thing called the inclusion benefit. And that would be, here I am, a child, I've not yet enrolled in the trial. And now there's a trial coming up where I either I'm going to be randomly assigned to get a drug or to get placebo. And let's say in both of those instances, the risk is greater than minimal risk. We'd say, well, the person getting the drug has the prospect of direct benefit. The person getting the placebo has greater than minimal risk, but no prospect of direct benefit. Some people would say, yes, but prior to enrolling, you have the prospect of direct benefit because maybe you're going to go in the placebo arm and maybe you're going to go in the intervention arm. The FDA has written some things. They're not set in stone, but they have written some things saying they don't think that that's the benefit. The benefit is once you're in the trial. But what they do recommend is the second to last bullet there, which is called component analysis. And by component analysis, that means you don't have to say that the entire trial has the same determination. You could say children who go into the placebo arm are only minimal risk, and they don't have a prospect of direct benefit. So they're a different pediatric determination than those who go in the interventional arm, where they do have the prospect of direct benefit, and we allow them to have higher risk. Make sense? So component analysis is allowed and encouraged by the FDA. I was at a recent HRPO, IRB type meeting that was in Baltimore this year, and the head of pediatric ethics at the FDA was there, and his whole talk was on component analysis, and so they really encourage this. Yes?
For the component analysis, so if you had two different determinations, would you have to have two different consents that they would have to sign both?
No, most of the time you put it all in one consent and say, if you're in the placebo arm, these are the expected risks. If you get randomly assigned to the intervention arm, these would be the risks. Yes?
How would you put that in Cicero? We'll let you pick one.
Yeah, so you can let HRPO worry about that. We've done it before, so we fix it. But we record it there, and I think typically what's done is the higher of the two is recorded in Cicero, even though we make sure in the minutes that it says that it's essentially a component analysis. Compensation, some people try to say that the compensation, the money or the gift cards or whatever, is a benefit. That may be the way that the participants look at it. It's not the benefit in the terms the way that we look at benefits. So don't try to use that as your benefit. The risk has to be justified by the anticipated benefit. The benefit to risk ratio is at least as favorable as presented by available alternatives. So this will come up in the IRB meetings, and that is, if the person decided not to go into the study, what's their risk-benefit ratio versus if you're in the study? And if it seems like it's at least as favorable to go in the study as to not go in the study, then it can be approved. Some of this is my opinion. Some of this is the way we do business. Some of this is from other people's opinions, saying this is what the guidelines say and this is how we interpret it. Sometimes beyond the guidelines are other things that have been written to try to clarify things but don't hold the same level of people having to hold to those requirements. You must hold to the CFR, but your interpretation of the CFR can vary, and I realize it varies quite a bit when I go to meetings where people bring up cases and then everyone out there is an IRB PEDS person and they all have different interpretations of minimal risk, greater than minimal risk, did they weigh the benefits appropriately. So it's not set in stone what's appropriate, but we do need to document each of these things, how we fit into each of these definitions. Okay, so 406s, that's the highest level that we can approve at our IRB, greater than minimal risk, but no prospect of direct benefit. Can only be a minor increase. What's the definition of minor increase? There is no definition. So we need to decide, is it a minor increase over minimal? It must be likely to yield generalizable knowledge about the subject's disorder or condition. And in that instance, most people have written, it has to be children who have a disorder or a condition. And we don't consider that living in Baltimore, being an adolescent. It means someone with a disorder or condition. Now, again, that's debatable, but most people, it seems the consensus is, yeah, it says disorder or condition. They mean people with a disease of some kind. Research procedures are commensurate with those inherent in the subject's actual or expected medical, dental, psychological, social, or educational situations. At the UMB, our IRB does the approving of these 406s, but because of the special scrutiny, if you will, we also have them reviewed by the institutional official, who is Dr. Bruce Jarrell at this point. And we have some 406s. This is not a common thing that we see at our IRB, but we do have some that get this designation. If it's a greater than minimal risk with no prospect of direct benefit, and the risk is greater than a minor increase over minimal, then we can't approve it. First, though, the IRB does determine if it provides a reasonable opportunity to further understand, prevent, or alleviate a serious problem. If so, it's submitted to OHRP, the Office of Human Research Protections at HHS. And then they solicit opinions of experts on a panel, and there's a period of public comment, and then after that, it can be approved. If it's under FDA regulations, meaning that it's a 21 CFR 50.54, the equivalent in the FDA, then the FDA commissioner has to pull together a panel. But what they say, at least, is that both HHS and FDA will pull together a panel at the same time if it's an FDA-regulated 407. So when parents allow children to be in studies, it's not consent, it's not assent. We call it parent permission. Parents are assumed in most instances, they're assumed, and we expect that in most instances they will act in the best interests of the child. Research involving children requires their permission with very few exceptions. We need to know about both the process and the documentation at the IRB. The documentation typically mirrors consent, so it looks like a consent form, but it's saying, here's what's going to happen to your child. Are you willing to allow your child to be in the study with these risks, these benefits, these alternatives, et cetera, et cetera? So it has the same elements as a consent form. It needs to be written and delivered in understandable language, which isn't easy, but in native language and as simple as possible, just like consent forms. And again, there's tension here between the voluntariness and the potential for undue influence, especially when there's a physician-patient relationship. So let's say you have a child who's ill and has the possibility of going into a research study, and it's the physician who could potentially who is caring for your child, who you trust, and that's the person who's asking if you want to be in the study. It's a difficult thing for parents to say no to the physician who's caring for their ill child. So it's important that we put in whatever protections we can to protect those children from from being put into a study by their parents in an undue fashion when the parents, may be concerned about the routine care of the child if they don't go into the study. How many parents? Well, for those first two categories, it's one parent. For the 406 and 407, it has to be two parents. The IRB has the prerogative of, even for those, the 404 and 405, meaning minimal risk or prospect of direct benefit, to have two parents. Usually for the minimal risk, I can say here, it's one parent that it's required, but for those 405, some of them, the IRB has recommended for two parents, depending on the situation. Can you waive parental permission? There are a few instances where it can occur, but since we're pretty much out of time, these slides will be posted. You guys can read up on what these are, but we take it very seriously if you're trying to waive either regular permission, consent, or waiving parental permission. What about mature minors? Now you may think that this is an oxymoron, that they're mature and they're minors, but Maryland does have recognizes mature minors. These are adolescents who have the legal authority to consent for particular types of care. So in Maryland, minors can consent as an adult to all medical and dental treatment if they are married, if they're a parent, if they're living separate from the parent or self-supporting, and if they have been emancipated before reaching the age of majority, which is 18 in Maryland. Emancipation can only occur by court decree. But they're very specific in Maryland about saying it isn't the emancipation process that allows people to consent to their treatment or to research. It's those who meet the definition of being a mature minor. So minors can consent to this list of things that you see here: pregnancy, treatment and advice about pregnancy, contraception, but not sterilization, STDs including HIV, emergency treatment, drug and alcohol, outpatient mental health services, but only for 16 and up, sexual abuse, assault, and rape, and to have their initial physical exam done if they're in a detention center. So again, going back to what are children in the federal regs, if they've not attained the legal age to consent for treatments and procedures. So mature minors, if they are potential subjects in a study in which the research involves only activities for which they could normally consent themselves, they are not considered children, and therefore Part D regulations may not apply. However, of course, we must be very careful in this zone to make sure that we're doing the right thing for these mature minors. But we do have some protocols here at the university where teenagers have been allowed to assent or consent for themselves if they were mature minors, if they're in a study that involves things they would normally be able to consent for in their routine medical care. Assent is a child's voluntary affirmation to participate in research. It's not the same as consent. And in almost all instances, we have parent permission plus child assent. And it means their affirmative agreement, not merely failing to object. IRB determines about the documentation of assent. Sometimes there's no documentation. Sometimes there's verbal with people writing down that the assent occurred. Other times it's written assent. Who has to assent? There's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Typically what's done here is from birth to age 6, there's no assent. From 7 to 11, it's verbal. And from 12 to 17, it's written. That doesn't have to be the way it is in every single protocol, but it's often done that way. There are some waivers of assent, which you can get on the slides, or you can look them up on the HRPO website. Compensation, we have to be careful not to lead to undue influence on the child or the parent. You might want to consider what the out-of-pocket costs or inconvenience, lost work, travel, and appreciation. Some worry that money can distort people's ability to choose. Other people that have written on this say that that's demeaning, that that is derogatory, that that's paternalistic. To say that I'm the parent of a child, and if you give me $5 to come to your clinic, that that's going to change my ability to act in the best interest of my child. People will say, you know, that's ridiculous. And other people say, no, any compensation, that may change someone's ability to make a rational decision in this instance. A lot of people would say that you direct the compensation in terms of out-of-pocket costs and travel and all of that to the parents, but if you're giving compensation as a form of appreciation, that those things could go to the children. So like books or toys or a movie pass or something like that. Because we're done with time, I'm not going to go through these, but there have been regulations to try to encourage that children are in studies. Like the FDA has a Modernization Act. There's a pediatric rule saying that you can't license drugs unless you have a promise to test them in kids later. And then just to end, this is a very good quote that I read in one of the papers preparing for the talk, so I'm just going to read the whole thing. The history of research in the U.S. should invest all who perform research involving children with a strong sense of humility, serving to remind us how easily the frail balance between social value of involving children in research and the protection of children from unnecessary harms can be tipped by utilitarian thinking, and that is that the end justifies the means, that whatever we get out of social value, that we're not doing what we need to protect the child. Although the future health of children is dependent on the performance of clinical research in which children participate, research must be carefully designed to assure that the participants are not placed at excessive risk or denied potential benefits unfairly. And then, not as top of quote, but what I have to say, although the regulations and IRBs exist to protect children, ultimately both the science and the well-being of children depend on knowledgeable, caring, responsible investigators and coordinators like you. The IRB tries to oversee that, but it's not really the IRB and HRPO whose job it is to protect the children and the parents. It's yours as the investigators, or mine when I'm doing the investigations. Whew, that's it. It's 2:09, so I know I went over, so people may have places to go, but if you have any questions, I'm glad to answer them publicly, or if people want to talk to me personally afterwards, I can answer questions as well. Yes?
If you have a parent that is a minor,
Yes?
can they sign a consent for their child?
I think it depends. Again, there's a lot of things that it's hard for. I don't want to give a single answer. There would be instances, I can imagine instances where the answer would be yes. But I would have to see the protocol. So if you have, for example, you have a 17-year-old who's living on their own, making their own way, essentially they're emancipated. They may not be called emancipated by the state, but they're living as an emancipated person, and they have a child, I think that we would allow for them to be able to make decisions for their child in research, just as we would for the medical care of their children. Would you allow them to make a medical decision for their child? Let's say they brought their kid in for, no?
You know, it depends on who's reading the rules.
Yeah.
Part of the reason I'm asking the question is for clarification. We have a lot of 15, 16, 17-year-old moms, single moms, living with their parents who technically have responsibility for their child because they are the parent.
Mm-hmm.
So can they sign a consent form for NICU research or?
Yeah, I think in all these instances, if you anticipate that occurring, then the best thing to do is to say you've thought it through, and these are the things that you're putting in place to try to protect the rights and welfare of the baby, of the child, in terms of how are you going to make sure that a 15-year-old understands a consent form. They understand the risks and the benefits to the child, that you're not giving them things that potentially would skew them more than it would an older person, that whatever those other safeguards that you're putting in place, I think if you proactively come to the IRB with how you're going to do that, then I think it would be likely that the IRB would allow it. Other questions? All right. Have a good afternoon.